Brr, it's cold out there. We just came in snuggling a bunch of snow. Now it's time to do a little biology. Get ready to go to work.
All right, just as he said, let's get to work. We're talking a little bit about how life could have started on our planet. You're also supposed to read an article about the origin of life, possibly starting in ice. Pretty interesting concept in class. We're going to read another article as well. But this is just kind of a little background going into our next unit of the history of life. We're going to look at life past this point. So when we talk about this is a mystery of life. Obviously, this is dating back to 3.5, so there's not a lot of evidence for what's going on. And so basically, a lot of our ideas or concepts are going to come from not necessarily the evidence that was presented then, but how could we recreate those situations? This first slide you can kind of read at your own time, but basically the idea is this: that this is an important concept on how life could have got started. An important note is we're not exactly sure how life came to be, and so these are all theories, but when we look at these theories, we want to look at what's the most scientific theory. And remember, the definition of a theory is the best explanation that science has to offer, so there could be a variety of ideas. One possible idea is that life maybe had an extraterrestrial origin. Now, I know what you're thinking when you hear the word extraterrestrial origin. You're maybe thinking of the movie E.T., or you're thinking of something like this, or something like that, or maybe, I don't know, something even like that if your name's Scott. But for the most part, when we're talking about extraterrestrial origin, we're not talking about that they were brought to Earth by aliens, but more by that they came from outside of our planet, maybe an asteroid or a meteor. And those are both possibilities. And some of those have merits just because we're finding more and more interesting stuff from some organic materials on asteroids. So basically the idea that the asteroids might have seeded our planet with some of the necessary ingredients for life to start on our planet. The other two main theories that there are divine creation and spontaneous origins. If we look first at the divine creation idea, there's a couple issues with that. Number one is that there are a lot of different cultures that have a lot of different beliefs on how life might have started divinely. So if we were to look at that, we'd have to look at a lot of different ones. Specifically, the Judeo-Christian model of that comes from the book of Genesis. There are also issues with that, being the fact there are two of them in that book. And like I said, there's a lot of differences between different religions and how their beliefs that life may have started. The major reason why we're not covering that, though, is because if you think back to the scientific process, we can't test this theory. What I mean by that is, since the divine creation requires a deity, we can't, and as Catholics we say it's not a good idea to just challenge God and say, show me how you did this. And so once again, we're not saying that this is not the possible way that life started. We're just saying from a scientific perspective, it's hard to study this. So once again, there's merit to looking into this in a philosophy or a theology class, but when we're talking about science class, it's a little bit outside of our jurisdiction as scientists. So we're going to put that on the back burner and let it be covered by other areas. So that leaves us with the spontaneous origin. Spontaneous, once again, just means from nothing. Out of nowhere comes that. And one of the things that we talked about early on about energy was the law of thermodynamics, that under current conditions on the Earth's planet, life cannot actually exist from nothing. And so the key to that thing is life currently, or our planet currently. If we look back in time, our planet was very different. And during that first billion years on our planet, our Earth would be unrecognizable. A lot of different things that were going on that were possible. So what we're going to look at is this idea is, could have life started spontaneously on our planet 3.5, well that's a bad pen, 3.5 billion years ago on a very different planet. A planet that looked very different than our current planet, or what we think of as Earth. So how could life start from a non-living source? Now, once again, when you look at this, it's kind of what we talked about with macroevolution. That if you look at it in just the entireness of it, it's really hard to see and understand. But at the end of the day, what it really is for us to look at or understand is that we have this non-living material on our planet that if we can figure out a way to convert that into simple organic materials such as amino acids, nucleotides, things like that, and then eventually if those simple organic molecules could reproduce, could replicate themselves, eventually that could lead to an organism. So the idea is if we can figure out this step and this step and this step, we could kind of get an idea how life could be. And once again, this what makes this idea testable. We are able to see how we can go from this to this, or from this to this, and this to this. Now, have we put all of it together and created life from nothing? No, but we're able to do many of the steps. And because of that, it does make this idea testable. Because it's testable, it does fall in the realm of science. All right, so you can kind of read through this and just kind of see the idea of, if we look at what Earth early had on our planet, we would need to be able to eventually from that make things like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. Okay, so we got to figure out how do we make those. So that's one of the first things that when we look at the spontaneous origin of life is how could we from nothing create proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, never mind an organism. Once again, that's a big step thing. It's going to require a lot of time. Let's look at it at more of a basic or fundamental level of let's just make some of those macromolecules. So a couple dates that you'll need to know for our test. Number one is that 14 billion. That's the approximate age of our universe. We get that from the Big Bang Theory. We also know that our Earth formed around 4.6 billion years. We talked about how I use the numbers 4.55 as well, but those are pretty basic numbers. Oldest rocks are 3.9. We talked about where we get this number from, and then why it's our Earth is actually older than 3.9, even though the oldest rocks are only that age. And then, once again, you got to look at this early atmosphere and what the Earth was like back then to really understand how life could form. It was not a very good place to live. The Earth was around 1700 degrees Celsius, pretty hot. The days were only about 6 hours long. There's no water, no oxygen. So, once again, if you decided to build a time machine and go back in time, probably wouldn't be the best idea, Andre. All right. As the Earth is forming, a couple things are happening from a geological perspective. Number one, your heavier materials are going to start to sink. So the Earth is much more fluid in its activity. It's much more liquid because of this heat. And so we see this changing occur. The core changes, the mantle changes. And once again, we're going to get, the Earth will eventually start settling out. And eventually we actually get these major rainstorms that do create our oceans. And that's about 3.9. All those dates are important to know. This test is a major date test. You got to know a lot of dates on there, so make sure you know all of those that are on this page. You might want to highlight them. I'd recommend keeping a note card with all the dates so you can kind of memorize and study them. This is a little bit of what our Earth actually looks like. You can see the upper mantle, lower mantle, all those different parts. The inner parts, the heavier materials, your core, that's solid iron and stuff like that. By the way, if you ever want to watch a movie that's completely unrealistic, watch the movie The Core where they drill into the Earth. It's hysterical how inaccurate it could possibly be. So, if you want a good laugh, try to watch that movie. All right. So, what was the Earth actually like back then? Number one, the gases were very different than we see today. There are gases that were on our early atmosphere were things like hydrogen, nitrogen, CO2. No oxygen on our planet, okay? So that's early on, there's no oxygen, just those types of materials. There's also things like a lot of water. Remember, higher concentration, because most of our oceans were trapped in there at the time. Methane, which is CH4, and ammonia. One idea is how life could have started was if we would have taken those chemicals, combined them to an energy source such as lightning or some type of friction that eventually could have caused the formation of some of our macromolecules that we needed, some carbohydrates or amino acids. We call that the primordial soup model. And then you can see about how the primordial soup model was originally proposed by A.A. Opper, and that's a name you might want to remember. And basically, he came up with saying, let's look at early Earth, see what's present, and see if we can figure out how we can generate life from that. It wasn't tested until Stanley Miller actually tested it. And basically what Miller did, pretty ingenious, he just took those early chemicals that we mentioned and he put them into a container and then just basically shocked them to see what he would get. And here's basically a setup. He'd heat the water to get the water vapor in here. Here's all the chemicals that we need, that we know were present on Earth, early Earth. Notice no oxygen. That's really important for this. Oxygen is an oxidizer. And anything that would form oxygen would break it down. So we don't want oxygen present. He zapped it, allowed it to cool for a couple days, and then looked at it, and what he found were some organic molecules. Okay, his words were a chemical zoo, things that shouldn't be in there naturally. He found amino acids, fatty acids, hydrocarbons, precursors to life. Okay, and so once again, why is this a scientific theory? He was able to prove, using a scientific test, that from Earth's early atmosphere, some organic molecules could form. Now, once again, it doesn't say that life formed, but just some of the precursors that could eventually lead to life. There is one major problem with this theory that we need to mention. Number one, at the time, people thought that the earliest, back when Miller was testing this, that life could have started about 2.5. We now know that life started at 3.5, which is important. It's a much longer time frame, much more likely for something like this to happen, so that's important. Number two, this oxygen argument that I told you about earlier. Oxygen is really important for Earth's earlier. Number one, if it was present, it's going to be converted into O3 and create an ozone layer that's going to protect the early Earth. If not, these molecules that would have formed would have been hit by UV light. And that UV light would have destroyed anything that existed. So we want oxygen present for that reason. But we don't want oxygen present for a different reason. Oxygen is an oxidizer, which will then break down and destroy anything that's created. So this is a little bit of an issue with the primordial soup. You need oxygen, but you don't want oxygen. And we know oxygen wasn't present. So the idea is this. If the early Earth was created using the primordial soup model, then there has to be some other way to protect those molecules other than ozone layer. And we'll see if we can find something that could do it. That's where the bubble theory comes in. And basically the idea is that if this happened in a bubble or in some deep ocean, that the ocean and the water itself could create a barrier to UV. UV does not penetrate bubbles, and it can act as an insulator, very similar to what the ozone layer could have done on a large scale, bubbles could have done for individual molecules. Additionally, the nice thing about a bubble is it increases the rate of the reaction. We're keeping these chemicals that are necessary in a smaller container and allowing for them more likely to actually interact. So the idea is if you were in a deep sea vent, those bubbles that are coming up from the deep sea vent, that could have been possibly where life could have formed. Now when you read the ice article, you'll notice that the ice article provides another protection from UV, obviously the ice itself. The next idea would be then where do we create proteins from? Proteins came from RNA. We believe that the first actual nucleic acids would have been RNA. Why is RNA more likely to be the nucleic acid than DNA? Well, it's smaller, it's simpler, much easier. Usually you're going to build the smaller things first and then from that the larger, right? You don't start complex and then break it down. And we can actually build RNA real easily in the lab setting from basically nothing. The ice article will talk a lot about how RNA could easily form in ice and how they've done studies and tests that have actually proven this theory. You'll read about that. And so if you have some RNA, basically RNA is not that long of a molecule. You randomly put these together. This is happening in billions of locations on our early Earth for thousands and millions of years, that eventually there's some replicating ability, and that could have been the precursors to life. Now, once again, you go back to that original formula of making organic molecules that can able to reproduce. We're not able to connect those three things, but we're able to take inorganics and make them into organic compounds. We're able to then take RNA, find out how we can make RNA. Doing the whole thing requires a lot of time And so we don't have that element to test it out, but we can do different stages of this. The other idea is microspheres. Microspheres are how do we form the actual cell. If you were to actually put lipids into a aqueous or water solution, it will naturally form spheres. You can pause the slide and kind of read. This slide kind of explains it to itself how it works. That could kind of create the precursors to the very first cell membranes, and therefore how life could actually not only reproduce but keep itself contained in some type of material. All right. Once again, the origin of life is one of those ideas that is pretty strongly supported in the scientific community. The only issue is, outside the scientific community, by the religious community, there is a lot of people that are against it. Obviously, science is not 100% sure. They're changing it. They're coming up with other theories. Like I said, you'll read the ICE article, and we'll read a new one in class next time. That kind of shows us how all possible ways in which life could have been. And there's a lot of different ways that maybe make sense to you. You might think that the extraterrestrial origins is much more realistic. Maybe you're a guy who thinks the promoted soup's more possible. Maybe the ice is the best one. And those are all fine to kind of think about. But you should go into it with a scientific approach and base your ideas after kind of doing a scientific method in your head. One issue that people have with this idea is the Earth's old enough. Once again, if you're not in the scientific community and you believe the Bible literally, and you think the Earth is anywhere between 10,000 and 20,000 years old, there's no way life could be on our planet the way it currently is using that formula. Well, people who believe in science think the Earth is much older than that, 4.55. Now, using that time frame, life could easily start spontaneously, okay? And so, it's important to look at that, make that comparison. As long as you accept the idea that life, our planet is that old, it's very easy to see how life could have formed. This is a short slide that talks about radioactive decay and how we can actually determine the age of something. I'm not going to spend too much time. We talked about this. I will also put on a little video on the portal, on Google Classroom, that'll help us to look at this in a little bit more detail. And once again, it'll just be provided as a reference for you to understand how we understand how old life is. So go ahead and read through this. If you have any questions, let's bring it to class. This slide goes with the last one, talks about half-life, how we can see how old things are. The good thing to understand about this, just realize we use different half-lives to look at different things. Carbon dating is much better for things that are much more recent. And then there's a process of how they actually go about radiometrically dating. You do need to actually take a piece of the fossil, and so sometimes that's a little bit sketchy about trying to destroy a big piece of a really important fossil. Another issue that people may have is that life is too complex to start spontaneously. And once again, I agree 100% with this. If you look at a human, to see how a human could form spontaneously, it's very hard to consider. We're talking about the formation of early Earth would have been bacteria. Now, since we understand what natural selection is, you take those very simple forms and you add a bunch of time to it, we can see how we can go from these simple life forms to much more complex. All right, the second law of thermodynamics, when people look at this second law, they'll use this to argue against it. Basically, the law of thermodynamics says that things tend towards chaos, towards unorganization, which in the universe is completely true, that things are becoming more and more complex, that energy is being, instead of being more organized, since the Big Bang, it's becoming more and more disorganized. So at first appears how life, which is more organized, would come from non-living things, seems to work against this law of thermodynamics. Remember, laws are always true. Well, the key word that people forget to add is that the law of thermodynamics, the second law of thermodynamics, applies to closed systems. In other words, systems that do not have input of energy. So when you look at the universe as a whole, the universe is not gaining any energy, and so therefore it does apply to that. The Earth, on the other hand, is gaining energy from the sun. Therefore, it is not a closed system, okay? Earth and all of its organisms are open systems. And in open systems, when energy is inputted, what tends to happen is the energy is going to be stored in other ways, and therefore we tend to see more complex things occurring. And so this does support the laws, the second law of thermodynamics. It is assumed that if you input energy, you're going to actually conserve it into a more stabilized form, an organism, our planet, things like that. The last thing is, people say, well, if there's life on our planet, there should be life on other ones. We haven't discovered it. Very true. But we should find life on other planets. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at how life could happen on other planets. Well, first off, let's look at our own planet. We know that if between 0 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit, life can exist. How do we know that? That's our planet. Okay? So the thing is, you need carbon, right? You need water. You need the right density. So what we look at is this Goldilocks hypothesis is saying Earth formed in this ideal conditions that we find on our current planet. So if we can find those ideal conditions that we have on Earth, on other planets, then the possibility of life could exist on those planets as well. Now, what's important to note is that's just for how life is on our planet. Life could have formed on other planets in very different conditions, and it would look very different as well. But the idea is, let's start by looking at how we know life can form. In other words, planets that fit ours. They're in the news all the time. You can Google right now Earth-like planets, and you'll see that all these are popping up. So that's what NASA and all these other organizations are looking at, is let's find Earth-like planets and see if those places have life. So what makes Earth so perfect? Number one, it's mass. Mass is a product of size and density. It's just right for life to exist. Why do we need to have the correct mass? If you have too strong of a gravitational pull, if you have a large mass, it can hold the gases that would be bad for us. If it's too light, those gases would scoot away that we really need, and then we're not protected. Our atmosphere wouldn't be protected. So the atmosphere that we have on Earth is a product of our density. And so if we can find a planet that has a similar density, odds are it might have a similar atmosphere, and therefore it could have all those things. Look at what the actual atmosphere does for us. It helps insulate us from temperature extremes. That's really important. If we're living in deep space and the sun's up and it gets really, really hot, sun's down and it gets really, really cold, that's hard for organisms to be able to survive that. And so this right here, to prevent that, is a product of our atmosphere. Protects against radiation like UV and a lot of other worse ones. And it still allows enough energy in to help fuel and provide energy for our environment. So once again, you have a thicker atmosphere, it may not allow some of these things. You have too thin, and these things factor in. So we want to find a planet that has a similar atmosphere as ours. One place that we look at where life could exist is in Europa, in our own universe. The reason is Europa is a moon. We know there's liquid underneath the ice down there, and once again, life could exist down below. Now, does that mean that it's going to be just like life on our planet? Probably not. It's going to be simpler life form, but it does have some possibilities. And we'll talk about in class some other places that are highly likely to possibly create life. Now, what are the odds of finding life? This is really interesting to me. So, our Milky Way galaxy and the nearby galaxy contain 100 billion stars. Once again, remember how big a billion is. The universe contains a billion galaxies. Okay, so the idea is that we estimate there are approximately 10 to the 20, or 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 stars that are actually similar to our sun. Okay, so we're looking at only the stars, not the big red giants and all that stuff, but stars that are very similar to our sun. Once again, why? Because we know our sun can produce life. And we say, well, how many of those have planets? At least 10%. Could be a lot higher, but we're starting with a low baseline. So therefore, if only 1 out of 10,000 of those planets in the universe have the right combination of mass, distance from the sun, all of those types of things. Okay? So in other words, if we just look at 1 out of 10,000 planets have similar situations, have the same sun as ours, how many times could life start? 10 to the 15, or 1,000,000 billion times life could exist. So the question is, are we that lucky on Earth that we're 1 in 1,000,000 billion? Or did life probably exist somewhere else in some capacity? Now, that's only assuming that life could form under our very narrow band or Goldilocks hypothesis that would be distance from the sun, proper sun, things like that. Could life actually exist elsewhere in a different way? Well, some scientists, that is possible. And basically, this would be, instead of using water as our source, they use ammonia. And instead of using carbon, they use silicon, because silicon acts very similar to carbon under colder environments. And so all the characteristics that make carbon special, so could silicon, ammonia, which it does not freeze. So in a planet that's a little bit colder, you could have life that instead of being carbon-based is silicon-based. So once again, that's if life can't form just like it did on Earth. There are other possibilities as well. Are we looking for that? We talk about SETI. You can read about that. We're going to actually talk a little bit more about this in class. We're going to look up some of the near-Earth planets that could support life. All right, so this is our video about how life could start on our planet. You also should read the ICE article. Gives another perspective on how life could start on our planet. We'll discuss those and prepare for a possible quiz for class next time. Thank you very much and have a good snow day.